In the hushed cathedral of Elysian Fields, a restaurant so discreet it was known only by the whisper of its name among the city's elite, silence was the most expensive item on the menu. The air, thick with the ghost of old money and new ambition, smelled of seared scallops and quiet desperation. For Alara Vance, it smelled mostly of fear. Every muted clink of sterling silver against hand-painted porcelain was a metronome counting down the seconds to the end of the month, to the rent she couldn't pay, to the final auction notice for her father's life's work. Her crisp black uniform, starched to the point of being armor, felt less like a professional garment and more like the costume of a ghost haunting a life that was never meant to be hers. This wasn't her world, not anymore. Her childhood was a sun-drenched mosaic of dusty excavation sites in the Levant. The scent of strong, cardamom-laced coffee brewed over open fires, and the ancient lyrical cadence of languages that were history's forgotten lullabies. Her father, Dr. Arthur Vance, had been more than a historian. He was a custodian of memory, a man who could read a story in a shard of pottery and hear a king's decree in the whisper of the wind across a ruin. She had grown up not with nursery rhymes, but with the Epic of Gilgamesh, her hands learning the shape of cuneiform tablets before they learned to properly hold a pen. That life had been pulverized into dust. A rogue wave of medical bills from her father's final, brutal illness had eroded their savings, followed by his passing, which had left a chasm in her world. All that remained was a mountain of debt in a small, rent-controlled apartment overflowing with the ghosts of his legacy. Shelves groaning under the weight of rare books, maps of forgotten cities, and research notes bound in fraying leather. The auctioneer's calls were becoming more frequent, his voice a vulture's cry over the carcass of her past. Now her universe was the polished Carrara marble of Elysian Fields, her purpose reduced to the silent, efficient delivery of truffle-infused everything. Tonight, the restaurant's signature calm was stretched thin, vibrating with a palpable tension that emanated from a single point of gravitational force. Table 4, the secluded corner booth known as the Citadel. It was occupied by Kalen Al-Jamil, the enigmatic head of the Al-Jamil Global Heritage Group, a conglomerate that didn't just build skyscrapers, but resurrected ancient cities, funding archaeological projects with the same ruthless efficiency it applied to its acquisitions. Forbes called him the Sphinx of Finance, a man whose face, rarely photographed, seemed chiseled from the same desert rock his ancestors had hailed from. To the staff, he was simply the Storm. His anger, it was rumored, didn't just kill deals, it altered geopolitical weather patterns. He was dining with Silas Croft, the CEO of Croft Development, a man whose ambition was as vast as his ethics were shallow. Croft was all gleaming teeth and a suntan that looked expensively applied, a predator cloaked in the soft cashmere of a pinstripe suit. The deal on the table was monumental, a joint venture to develop a massive coastal region in Al-Jamil's home country, a project that would either be a model of sustainable, culturally integrated development or a soulless scar of glass and steel on a pristine landscape. Ilara had been assigned the Citadel by Mr. Abernathy, the restaurant's manager, a man who seemed to perspire pure anxiety. "Vance," he'd whispered, his words damp with panic. "Breathe only when you must. Do not exist. Do not have opinions. You are a mechanism for the delivery of food and the removal of plates. One wrong move, and Mr. Al-Jamil's displeasure could foreclose on this entire establishment." For the first 90 minutes, Alara was a masterclass in non-existence. She moved with a liquid grace honed by years of practice, refilling water glasses with San Pellegrino as if pouring liquid moonlight, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. The conversation at the table was a brutal chess match played with veiled threats and billion-dollar pawns. Croft was a symphony of sycophantic charm, while Al-Jamil was a fortress of silence, his occasional words landing with the weight of catapult stones. He barely registered her presence, his focus absolute, his dark, obsidian eyes missing nothing. She felt the familiar, acid sting of invisibility. She was furniture, an appliance. She remembered sitting on a canvas stool at her father's dig site, debating the translation of an Ugaritic text with visiting scholars, her opinion sought and valued. Now, the most valuable thing about her was her ability to vanish. Her mind drifted to the letter on her kitchen table, the final notice from the rare book dealer who held the lien on her father's collection. 30 days. That's all she had left. She was clearing the appetizer plates, Dover sole tartare with Ocitra caviar, when the first crack appeared in the evening's facade. One of Croft's vice presidents, a brash young man named Todd, attempted a clumsy display of cultural rapport. "You know, Kalen," he said, his voice offensively loud in the quiet alcove, "I've been practicing. Shukran. See? Getting the hang of it." Kalen al-Jamil's gaze, which had been fixed on a schematic on his tablet, lifted. It was not a glance. It was an act of geological pressure. He said nothing, but the temperature in the booth dropped 20 degrees. Todd's smug grin faltered and died. Elara's hand, steady as a surgeon's just moments before, trembled almost imperceptibly as she stacked the Limoges plates. It was the casual, brutal appropriation of it all. The reduction of a language woven from poetry and prayer into a cheap party trick, a token to be flashed for favor. It was the same entitled ignorance her father had spent his life fighting against. She retreated to the kitchen's swinging doors, the heat from the stoves a welcome contrast to the ice in the dining room. It wasn't just the mangled Arabic. It was the whole grotesque play, the soulless men carving up a piece of the world she knew and loved, while she was fighting to keep the last fragments of her own world from being sold to the highest bidder. The ghost of her father seemed to stand beside her, his disappointment a palpable weight. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she smoothed the front of her uniform, plastered a neutral mask on her face, and prepared to re-enter the battlefield. The main course, a rack of lamb encrusted with pistachios and lavender, was yet to be served. The storm was still gathering. The main courses arrived beneath domes of polished silver, unveiled in a synchronized flourish that was Elysian Field's signature piece of theater. Elara performed the ritual with the detached precision of a machine, but the air at table 4 had curdled. The thin veneer of civility had been sandblasted away, revealing the raw, grating friction of a negotiation on the precipice of total collapse. Silas Croft, his face flushed with vintage Bordeaux and simmering rage, had abandoned all pretense. "Let's be frank, Kalen," Croft said, leaning forward, his voice a low, aggressive growl. "My team has bent over backwards. We've offered unprecedented profit sharing. What more do you want? Blood?" Kalen al-Jamil placed his knife and fork beside his untouched lamb, the silver making a quiet, definitive click against the porcelain. "I want respect, Silas. It is a concept your prospectus seems to have omitted." "Respect?" Croft scoffed, a short, ugly laugh. "This is a $100 billion development, not a sensitive feelings seminar. We're building a world-class resort that will bring thousands of jobs." "You are proposing to build a glass cage on the Ras Al Khaimah coast," Kalen countered, his voice dangerously soft. "The land you have designated for your championship golf course is less than a kilometer from the Jebel Faya archaeological site, a place where my ancestors lived over 100,000 years ago." Elara froze mid-pour, the bottle of Evian hovering over a crystal glass. Jebel Faya. She had been there. As a girl of 14, she had spent a summer on a dig with her father, carefully brushing dust from Neolithic tools, the sun warm on her back. She remembered the profound, humbling silence of the place, the feeling of standing on ground that held the deepest secrets of human history. The image of a golf course, a grotesque green cancer on that sacred land, filled her with a sudden, violent nausea. Croft, utterly oblivious, waved a dismissive hand. "History is lovely, Kalen, but it doesn't sign paychecks. We're talking about progress. You can't let a pile of old rocks stand in the way of the future." That was it. The final, unforgivable blasphemy. The dismissal of 100 millennia of human existence as a pile of old rocks. It wasn't just an insult to Kalen's heritage. It was an insult to the very concept of heritage itself, a desecration of everything her own father had held sacred. Kalen's face became a granite mask of cold fury. He pushed his chair back, the heavy legs screaming in protest against the marble floor. The sound ripped through the restaurant's delicate ambiance like a bolt of lightning. "This meeting," he stated, his voice quiet but carrying the absolute authority of a king passing sentence, is over. His two aides, who had been as silent as statues all evening, rose in perfect unison, gathering their files. Mr. Abernathy, who had been watching from a safe distance, practically teleported to the table, his face the color of spoiled milk. "Mr. Al-Jamil, sir, is there a problem? The lamb, is it not to your satisfaction? I can have the chef." Kalen looked straight through him, his eyes black holes of contempt. His focus was entirely on the stunned Silas Croft. "You come to my country, you ask for my partnership, and you show me that you understand nothing of its soul. You believe your money absolves you of the need for wisdom. It does not." He turned to Croft and, in a gesture of ultimate dismissal, delivered what he thought would be the final blow. "Perhaps this will make you understand the value I place on history." He gestured to a member of his security team who stepped forward with a flat velvet-wrapped box. Croft had presented it earlier as a token of partnership. "A gift," Kalen said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He unwrapped it and placed it on the table. It was a small clay tablet covered in cuneiform script, mounted on a plush black stand. "A 3,000-year-old Assyrian trade receipt," Croft had boasted when he gave it, "a symbol of our future commerce, rooted in the rich history of your region." Kalen stared at it, his lip curled in disgust. To him, it was just another trinket, another piece of his culture commodified and presented by a barbarian. The ultimate insult. He turned to one of his aides and began speaking in rapid, furious Arabic, the dialect crisp and formal, a language of command. Ilara, rooted to the spot by the table, understood every syllable. "Khalas al-mufawadat intahat." It is finished. The negotiations are over. Tell the pilot the jet is to be ready in 1 hour. We are leaving, and I want you to initiate a hostile takeover bid for Croft Development's primary lender. I will own his debt by sunrise. I will dismantle his company piece by piece. The aide nodded grimly, his fingers already flying across his phone. Croft stood, sputtering, "Now wait a minute, Kalen. Let's not be hasty." But Kalen had already turned his back, a vortex of controlled Arctic rage, striding toward the exit. The entire restaurant was now a tableau of shock, diners frozen with forks halfway to their mouths. Ilara watched him go, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw the deal imploding, Abernathy's career evaporating. But she felt something else, something deeper. An intense, righteous anger on Kalen's behalf and on her father's. Croft's ignorance was a poison, and Kalen's pride was the storm that would destroy everything. But as Kalen reached the grand archway leading out of the main dining room, his path to devastating escape clear, Ilara saw not just the insult, but the specific, horrifying detail that Kalen himself, in his fury, had missed. The tablet, the gift. It wasn't just a trinket, it was something far, far worse. And in that instant, she did the one thing she was forbidden to do. She broke the silence. She existed. As Kalen Al-Jamil's hand-stitched Italian leather shoe was about to cross the threshold into the lobby, a voice clear and steady sliced through the paralyzed dining room. It wasn't Abernathy's panicked pleading or Croft's blustering indignation. It was a woman's voice speaking not English, but a pure academic strain of Arabic, a dialect a scholar would use, not a native speaker from the street. "Laysat ashuriyatan ya sayyidi, inaha akadia, min kisbat uruk, walakinaha muzawara." It is not Assyrian, sir, it is Akkadian, from the digs at Uruk, and it is a forgery. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Kalen Al-Jamil froze. He didn't just stop, his entire being ceased all forward momentum, as if he had walked into a wall of solid glass. His hand, which had been gesturing dismissively to his security detail, remained suspended in midair. The universe of his fury collapsed into a single point of silent, profound shock. He turned not slowly, but with the sharp, deliberate motion of a predator that has heard the snap of a twig directly behind it. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, scanned the room, bypassing the panicked manager and the dumbfounded executives, searching for the source of that impossible voice. The restaurant had fallen into a silence so deep it felt like the pressure before a deep-sea dive. Diners stared, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. Silas Croft and his team looked around in utter befuddlement, having understood nothing of the words but everything of their cataclysmic impact on the billionaire. Ilara stood by the chaos of table 4, her back straight as a spear, her hands clasped tightly behind her to still their shaking. Her heart was a trapped bird beating against the cage of her ribs, but her voice had been a blade. She hadn't quoted a proverb or offered a placation. She had delivered a fact, a devastating, expert, undeniable fact. Kalen's gaze found her. He stared at the waitress, the anonymous ghost in the black uniform. For the first time, he truly saw her. He saw past the apron to the fierce intelligence burning in her clear gray eyes, the proud, defiant set of her jaw. There was no trace of the servile employee in her posture now. She met his gaze without flinching, holding it, her expression a mixture of terror and resolve. He took one slow, measured step back into the dining room. Then another. He moved not with anger, but with a dawning, dangerous curiosity. His aides exchanged bewildered glances. Their mission to exit aborted, their training giving them no protocol for this. He stopped a few feet from the table, his eyes never leaving Ilara's face. He spoke to her in Arabic, his tone stripped of fury, replaced now by the sharp, incisive edge of a cross-examiner. "Repeat what you said." Ilara swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I said the tablet is not Assyrian, it is Akkadian, styled after artifacts from the Uruk period. But it is a forgery, a very good one, but a forgery nonetheless." She switched to English, her voice gaining strength. "The cuneiform is too precise. The stylus impressions are too uniform. Ancient scribes had unique hands, inconsistencies. This was made by a machine or a master forger with a modern tool. And the symbol for barley in the third line is anachronistic. It's a later Babylonian form." Every word was a hammer blow of truth, dismantling Croft's pathetic gift, and more importantly, establishing her own impossible expertise. She had not just identified the object, she had performed a full academic analysis in under 10 seconds. A flicker of something, disbelief, astonishment, a grudging respect, passed through Kalen's eyes. He had been surrounded for weeks by geologists, engineers, and financial analysts, all claiming to be experts. And now a waitress, in the middle of a collapsing deal, had just demonstrated a level of arcane knowledge that would rival that of a university professor. He picked up the tablet from the table, his long fingers tracing the script. He looked from the clay to her face, a silent question in his eyes. "My father," she said, answering the unasked question, her voice trembling slightly. "He was Dr. Arthur Vance. He taught me." The name landed in the silent room with the weight of a dropped stone. Arthur Vance. Kalen's expression changed completely. The suspicion in his eyes was replaced by something akin to reverence. He knew the name. Every serious historian, every patron of Near Eastern archaeology, knew the name of Arthur Vance, the brilliant, uncompromising purist who had disappeared from the academic world years ago. Kalen looked at Silas Croft, who was now beginning to sweat, realizing the ground was shifting beneath his feet in a way he could not comprehend. He looked at the blubbering, useless Abernathy. Then his gaze returned to Ilara, the daughter of Arthur Vance, serving canapes in his restaurant. In that moment, a new strategy, a new possibility, a new world of opportunity coalesced in his brilliant mind. He made a decision that would not just alter the evening, but the very foundations of the deal in the trajectory of Ilara's life. He gestured curtly to his bewildered aides. "Wait in the vehicle," he commanded in Arabic. Then, switching to a globally understood language of absolute power, he addressed the room. To Silas Croft, he said, "Our prior discussion is concluded. A new one will begin tomorrow. Do not be late." To the petrified Mr. Abernathy, he said, "Clear this entire section of the restaurant. Now, I require absolute privacy." And finally, his voice low and intense, his eyes locked on Ilara, he gave his last command. You are not a waitress anymore. Sit down. You and I have a great deal to discuss." The expulsion was swift and merciless. Mr. Abernathy, galvanized by a terror that transcended his professional incompetence, shooed the stunned and indignant Croft development team out of the alcove like a frantic sheepdog. He then hovered for a moment, his mouth opening and closing silently, before Kalen dismissed him with a glare so cold it could have flashed frozen champagne. Alara was left alone in the citadel with the billionaire. The half-eaten remains of the lavish dinner lay between them, a battlefield littered with the casualties of a war that had ended and another that was just beginning. The adrenaline that had fueled her defiant outburst was draining away, leaving a hollow, terrifying void in its place. She had just gambled her entire, fragile existence on a single sentence. "Sit," Kalen repeated, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. He gestured to the chair Silas Croft had just vacated. She sat, her movements stiff and awkward. The starched uniform felt absurd, a child's costume in a room where fates were decided. She placed her hands in her lap, her knuckles white, and waited for the verdict. Kalen also sat, not leaning back in a posture of power, but leaning forward, his forearms on the table, closing the distance between them. He picked up the forged tablet, turning it over in his hands. He wasn't looking at her, but she felt the full force of his focus. "Arthur Vance's daughter," he said, more to himself than to her. "I read his monograph on oblate administrative texts when I was at Oxford. It was foundational. The academic world has missed him." He finally looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "What happened?" Taking a breath that felt like her first in an hour, Alara told him. She spoke of her father's illness, the crippling debt, the slow, agonizing dismantling of their life. She spoke of the books, the maps, the lifetime of knowledge currently being held hostage by an auction house. She did not cry or plead for pity. She stated the facts with a quiet dignity that was, in its own way, a fortress. As she spoke, she watched the layers of the billionaire, the corporate titan, peel away. He was listening not as a potential employer, but as a student of history, a peer in a world of shared passion. He understood the sanctity of a library, the tragedy of knowledge lost. "So you stand here, with his mind in your head, serving wine to men who would pave over the hanging gardens of Babylon to build a parking garage?" He mused, a bitter irony in his voice. He placed the tablet down. "This forgery, it's more than an insult. It's a message. Croft thinks me a fool, an uncultured savage with a deep wallet. He believes my heritage is a commodity he can buy a cheap replica of, and I will be grateful." He paused, his brilliant mind working, connecting dots she couldn't yet see. "He underestimated me, but more importantly, he had no idea that you were in this room." He leveled his gaze at her, and it was no longer the gaze of a man looking at a waitress, but of a general identifying his most crucial, unexpected weapon. "I am going to offer you a position, Ms. Vance, and it is not a token job." Alara's mind reeled. "A job? Sir, I have no corporate experience. My resume says head waitress for the last 3 years." "I am not interested in your resume," he cut in sharply. "I am interested in your legacy. Croft and his people are blind. They are negotiating for land and resources. They do not understand that what I am truly protecting is history. They need a translator, but not one who just translates words. They need one who can translate context, value, and honor. They need a bridge to a world they are too arrogant to see." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial pitch. "This deal is not about a resort. It's about securing a 500 square kilometer coastal region under a cultural preservation trust managed by my foundation. Croft's resort is the price I am willing to pay to get it. He thinks he's the shark. In reality, he is the bait." The scale of his ambition was breathtaking. She had been watching a chess match, thinking it was about capturing a few pieces, when in fact, Kalen was playing to win the entire board, the country, the history itself. "I want you to be my personal advisor on this negotiation," he stated, "effective immediately. You will sit at the table with me. You will analyze every proposal, not just for its financial implications, but for its historical and cultural ones. Your voice will be the one that tells me where the real value lies and where the unforgivable insults are hidden." He named a consulting fee, a single number that made the air rush from Alara's lungs. It wasn't just a salary, it was a liberation. It was the sum she needed to pay the debts, to reclaim her father's collection, to breathe again. It was a lifeline thrown from the most unexpected ship in the roughest of seas. I don't know what to say, she stammered, overwhelmed. I don't have the proper attire. I have people who solve problems like attire, he said, dismissing her practical concerns with an impatient wave. What I cannot buy is what is already in your head, the knowledge Arthur Vance gave you. That is priceless, and that is what I am hiring. He stood, signaling the end of the discussion. A car will be at your apartment at 6 a.m. An associate will be in touch within the hour for your address and details. They will bring a contract and a preliminary dossier. We resume negotiations with Croft at 9. He started to walk away, then stopped at the edge of the alcove and looked back at her. The full force of his formidable personality was focused on her once more. There is one non-negotiable condition, Ms. Vance. What is it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. From this moment forward, your loyalty is not to this restaurant, not to your past circumstances, but to me. And more importantly, to the legacy we are trying to protect. I am entrusting you with a secret war. I need to know you are a reliable soldier. She stood up, her spine straightening, the ghost of the waitress finally and fully banished. She met his gaze, and her voice, when she spoke, was as clear and steady as it had been when she exposed the forgery. You have it, she said. He gave a single sharp nod of satisfaction, and then he was gone, leaving Alara standing alone in the silent, wreckage-strewn alcove, the forged tablet sitting on the table like a trophy from her first victory. She had entered Elysian Fields that night a ghost. She would leave it as a Queen's Counsel. The following morning was a dizzying metamorphosis. At precisely 6 a.m., a silent, obsidian-black Maybach was waiting outside her modest walk-up, its presence in her neighborhood as incongruous as a spaceship. A woman named Zara, Kalen's chief of staff, greeted her with crisp efficiency and an encrypted tablet. Inside Alara's apartment, an entire rack of exquisitely tailored clothing had been delivered, transforming her small living room into a bespoke boutique. The contract lay on her kitchen table. Its clauses, as elegant as its compensation package, was staggering. She signed it with a hand that was now perfectly steady. By 9 a.m., she was walking into a penthouse boardroom overlooking the city, the view a dizzying panorama of power. She wore a charcoal gray suit that fit like a second skin, the fabric a silent testament to her new station. She felt not like an imposter, but like a woman finally wearing her own skin. The atmosphere in the room was electric. Silas Croft and his team were already there, their expressions a sour cocktail of resentment, confusion, and forced professionalism. Croft's eyes widened almost comically when Alara entered and took the seat directly to Kalen Al-Jamil's right. A new addition to the team, Kalen? Croft sneered, unable to help himself. Promoted from the waitstaff? Before Alara could even register the insult, Kalen answered, his voice as smooth and cold as the marble table. Ms. Vance is my new senior advisor for cultural and historical assets. Her counsel is integral to every aspect of this venture. I suggest you address her with the respect her position and her expertise commands. The sneer evaporated from Croft's face, replaced by a wary scowl. The game had changed, and he didn't know the new rules. The day was an exercise in subtle warfare. Alara's role was far more than symbolic. When Croft's team presented their revised plans for the resort, she didn't just listen, she intervened. The proposed desalination plant on this map, she said, her voice calm and authoritative as she pointed to a specific coordinate, is positioned directly over the suspected site of a Bronze Age settlement. The vibrations from the construction alone would destroy any chance of a proper excavation. It must be moved at least 5 kilometers to the west. Croft's engineers exchanged panicked looks. She was right. It was a detail buried in a geological survey they had assumed no one on Kalen's team would bother to cross-reference with an archaeological one. Later, when they discussed the project's name, the Croft Oasis, she spoke again. The name is inappropriate, she stated flatly. It implies this land was a barren wasteland before you arrived. The local tribes have called that coastline Beit al-Nujum, House of the Stars, for 1,000 years. Any development that proceeds will honor that name. She wasn't just translating language. She was translating meaning, history, and respect. With every point she made, she could see Kalen's quiet approval and Croft's mounting fury. She was dismantling his proposal not with financial objections, but with a moral and historical authority he could not counter. She was turning his ignorance into a liability. During a tense lunch break, Kalen spoke to her privately on the suite's terrace. "My grandfather used to tell me," he said, looking out at the sprawling city below, "that a man who builds without knowing the stories of the ground beneath his feet is not a builder, but a vandal. Today, for the first time in this negotiation, I feel like we are building." He turned to her, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "My father would have liked your father very much." It was in that moment, a quiet admission of a shared legacy, that a fragile, unexpected bond began to form between them. It was a connection forged not in romance, but in a profound mutual respect for the past, in a shared vision for the future. But with this new influence came new dangers. She noticed the resentful glares from Kalen's own long-standing aides, who now saw her as an upstart, a sudden favorite who had usurped their proximity to power. One of them, a stern older man named Tariq, approached her by the coffee station. "You are playing a dangerous game," Tariq warned, his voice a low hiss. "You remind him of the past. His duty is to the future, to profit, to growth. This sentimentality you encourage, it is a weakness." "His connection to the past is his greatest strength," Ilara countered coolly, not backing down. "It's the one thing Croft can't buy and can't fight. Without it, he's just another rich man. With it, he's a king defending his kingdom." Tariq's eyes narrowed. "You are a waitress who got lucky. Do not forget it." The threat was clear. She was not just battling Silas Croft's greed. She was navigating the treacherous internal politics of Kalen's own court. She had earned the king's favor, but in doing so, she had made enemies in his council, men who saw her not as an asset, but as a threat to their own standing. And she was about to discover just how far they would go to see her fall from grace. On the fourth day, they reached a breakthrough. The hostility in the penthouse had been replaced by a grudging, fragile sense of progress. Ilara's proposed solution, a joint venture to fund a new national archaeological institute alongside the development, was a masterstroke. It was a bridge built of mutual interest, honoring Kalen's legacy while providing Croft with the positive PR and tax incentives he craved. As the meeting concluded, Kalen had looked at her, his expression one of open admiration. "You don't just see the pieces, Ilara," he'd said, his use of her first name a quiet intimacy. "You see the entire board, past, present, and future." The words had settled in her heart, a warmth that no paycheck could provide. For the first time since her father's death, she felt truly seen. That evening, back in the palatial silence of her hotel suite, a profound sense of peace washed over her. The tailored suit no longer felt like a costume. It was her skin. The complex legal documents spread across the table were no longer intimidating. They were her language. This was the world she was born for, the world from which she had been unjustly exiled. Her laptop chimed, an alert for a new email. It was from Kalen's personal, heavily encrypted account. The subject, "For your eyes only, final strategy." Her breath hitched. Inside was the ultimate document of trust. It wasn't just the revised proposal, it was their entire playbook. It contained the tiered concession strategy, the sensitive financial vulnerabilities of Al Jamil Global Heritage, and, most critically, the absolute bottom-line figure they would accept before walking away. A number known only to Kalen and two other board members. He was bringing her into the inner sanctum. For 2 hours, she immersed herself in the document, memorizing numbers, cross-referencing clauses, preparing for the final push. She was his advisor, his strategist, his partner in this war. When she finally shut the laptop, the city lights below seemed to glitter in applause. She allowed herself, for the first time, to imagine a future, a purpose. She awoke the next morning feeling invincible. She chose a suit the color of deep cobalt, its sharp lines a reflection of her newfound confidence. Walking onto the penthouse floor, she was ready to close the deal, to seal their victory. The moment she stepped out of the elevator, however, that feeling shattered into a million shards of ice. The atmosphere was wrong. It wasn't the charged energy of negotiation. It was the dead cold air of a morgue. Croft's team was gathered on one side, their expressions no longer resentful, but radiating a smug, predatory triumph. Silas Croft himself leaned against the table, a venomous smile playing on his lips. On the other side stood Kaylin's team. Tariq, the aide who had warned her, looked pale and agitated, but it was Kaylin who stopped her heart. He stood by the window, his back to the room, but the rigid set of his shoulders was that of a man turned to stone by a terrible, absolute fury. "What's going on?" she whispered to Zara. Before anyone could answer, Croft's voice boomed across the room. "Ah, the senior advisor arrives, just in time for the denouement." Kaylin turned slowly, and the look in his eyes was a physical blow. The respect, the warmth, the nascent partnership, all of it was gone. In its place was a barren Arctic wasteland of pure betrayal. He looked at her as if she were a serpent he had foolishly welcomed into his home. "Last night," Croft continued, savoring each word like a fine wine, "we received a most illuminating anonymous email. It seems we've been over-negotiating." He tapped his tablet, turning the screen for all to see. Ilara's world spun off its axis. Displayed on the screen, in perfect damning detail, was the final strategy document. Her document, the one sent only to her. "Every concession, every vulnerability, every last cent of your bottom line," Croft purred. "It appears the price of loyalty has gone down significantly. The deal we discussed yesterday is, of course, off the table. Our new offer, which is non-negotiable, reflects this new transparency. The sabotage was perfect. It was a corporate kill shot." Kaylin's voice, when he finally spoke, was a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the floor. He addressed Tariq, but his eyes, filled with a hurt so deep it looked like hate, never left Ilara. "How many people had access to that file, Tariq?" Tariq wrung his hands, a picture of distress. "Only your most trusted circle, sir. The executive board and—" He let his voice trail off, casting a sorrowful, damning glance at Ilara. "You granted Ms. Vance access last night." The accusation hung in the room, thick and poisonous. "A girl from a restaurant," one of Croft's VPs scoffed, shaking his head in mock pity. "You give her a taste of the good life, and she cashes out for the jackpot. Can't say I'm surprised. She has no history with us, no long-term stake," Tariq added, his voice a blade of carefully crafted reason coated in poison. "People in desperate financial situations, they make desperate choices." The narrative was flawless. The poor girl, dazzled by wealth, who sold out her benefactor for an even bigger payday from the other side. It was simple, ugly, and to everyone in that room, utterly believable. She turned to Kaylin, her heart splintering. "Kaylin, I didn't. I would never." Her voice was a desperate whisper. She took a step toward him. "I swear on my father's memory, I did not do this." At the mention of her father, a flicker of doubt, of pain, crossed Kaylin's face. For a single, breathtaking second, she thought she had reached him. But then his pride, wounded and humiliated before his greatest rival, slammed a wall of ice back down between them. He had allowed himself to trust. This was his reward. "Leave the room, Ms. Vance," he commanded. His voice was flat, dead, devoid of all emotion, which was infinitely worse than shouting. It was the voice of a man erasing her from existence. "Return to your suite. Await instructions." The dismissal was total, an excommunication. As she turned to leave, her legs numb, she felt the searing heat of Croft's triumphant gaze and the cold satisfaction of Tariq's on her back. The dream was over. She had flown too close to the sun, and the fall back to earth was going to destroy her completely. The click of the suite door closing behind her was the sound of a tomb being sealed. The opulent room, once a symbol of her impossible ascent, was now a prison of silk and marble. She sank onto the bed, the luxurious duvet feeling like a shroud. A tidal wave of shame and despair crashed over her, so powerful it stole her breath. Kaylin's face, that mask of cold betrayal, was burned into her mind. He didn't just think she was guilty. He thought she was cheap. He believed her soul, her loyalty, her father's legacy, all had a price tag, and that Silas Croft had met it. She thought of the hopeful conversations with her mother, the reclaimed books, the future she had dared to imagine. It was all ash. Her first instinct was to obey, to pack her old worn bag and vanish, to crawl back into the anonymous hole from which she'd come. But as she stared at her reflection in the vast mirror, a pale, shattered woman in a suit of armor that had failed to protect her, a different feeling began to smolder in the pit of her stomach, a tiny, defiant ember refusing to be extinguished. Anger, cold, clear, and righteous. They had all underestimated her. Croft with his venal greed, Tariq with his venomous jealousy, and even Kalen with his proud, wounded blindness. They saw the waitress. They saw the desperate girl. They had no idea who Arthur Vance's daughter truly was. She closed her eyes and her father's voice echoed in her memory, not as a whisper of grief, but as a lesson. In any puzzle, Alara, the truth is not in the most obvious piece. It's in the detail everyone else has dismissed as unimportant. She stopped thinking like a victim and started thinking like a strategist. Her mind became a catalog, replaying every meeting, every conversation, every glance from the past week, searching for the unimportant detail. And then it came to her, emerging from the fog with stunning clarity. 2 days ago, a coffee break, Tariq and one of Croft's junior analysts, a nervous, fidgety young man named Peterson, standing in a hallway alcove, a little too close. Tariq had been speaking in a low, intense voice, his hand briefly gripping Peterson's arm. Peterson had looked terrified, nodding jerkily. At the time, she dismissed it as inter-team pressure. Now she saw it for what it was, a transaction, a point of leverage. Her mind caught fire. She had no proof, only a flicker of an observation. She needed more. There was one person she could call, a lifeline to her old world, Marcus Thorne. He had been the head of embassy security in her father's last posting, a former MI6 analyst who could find a digital needle in a global haystack. He owed her father his career. "Marcus, it's Alara Vance," she said, her voice low and urgent. "I need a ghost profile on a junior analyst at Croft Development named Daniel Peterson. I need vulnerabilities, financial, personal, anything. I need to know what kind of hook a man like Tariq Al-Jamil could sink into him, and I need it an hour ago." Marcus, a man of few words and immense capability, simply said, "On it. Wait for the signal." The next 55 minutes were an eternity. She paced the suite, a caged tigress, her mind constructing and discarding a dozen different strategies. This was her only shot. If she was wrong, she wasn't just fired. She was finished. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message. The profile was brief and brutal. Daniel Peterson. Clean record, but his younger sister required a highly experimental, unapproved treatment for a rare neurological disorder. The cost was astronomical, and his insurance had denied the claim. The final sentence was the key. An anonymous donation covering the full cost of the first year of treatment was made to the research hospital's charitable fund 3 days ago. Untraceable offshore account. There it was. Not greed, love, desperation. Tariq hadn't bought a traitor. He had leveraged a brother's love for his dying sister. Now came the endgame. She couldn't just present this to Kalen. It was circumstantial. She needed a confession. She needed to set a trap. Taking a deep breath, she composed a text message directly to Kalen's personal number. Her fingers flew across the screen, each word a carefully chosen chess move. "I know who betrayed you. It was not me. It was Tariq, using one of Croft's analysts. I can prove it, but you must trust me one last time. Gather both teams in the penthouse in 1 hour. Tell them you are capitulating, accepting Croft's new terms. It is essential that Tariq and Croft believe they have won completely." She pressed send, her heart hammering. She was asking the proudest man she had ever met to feign absolute surrender based on the word of the woman he believed was his ultimate betrayer. It was an insane gamble. An hour later, a knock came at her door. It was Kalen's head of security. "Mr. Al-Jamil requests your presence." She walked down the hall, her posture regal, her fear locked behind a mask of cold resolve. This was not a walk of shame. It was a declaration of war. When she entered the penthouse, the scene was one of gloating victory. Croft and his team were pouring champagne. Tariq stood near Kalen, a look of somber, dutiful support on his face. Kalen himself was playing his part perfectly, his expression one of grim defeat. He met her eyes for a fraction of a second, and in them she saw a flicker of hope. He had agreed to her gamble. "Well, well," Croft sneered, raising his glass. "Come to watch the empire fall." Ilara ignored him. She walked to the center of the room, her presence immediately commanding silence. Her gaze settled, not on Kalen, not on Croft, but on the pale, nervous Daniel Peterson. "Daniel," she began, her voice soft but carrying an edge of steel. "I was so sorry to hear about your sister's condition. It must be a tremendous relief to know her treatment is now fully funded." The color drained from Peterson's face. Tariq went rigid. "That kind of hope, it's priceless, isn't it?" Ilara continued, her voice laced with a terrible, knowing sympathy. "A man would do anything to secure it. He might even forward one little email. A victimless crime, he'd be told. Just a way to help the negotiations along and ensure the funding for his sister continues." A promise made by a powerful man. She let her eyes drift to Tariq, whose face was now a mask of pure fury. "But men who deal in betrayal rarely keep their promises. Do they, Daniel? Did he promise you a future? Or did he just use your family's pain to soothe his own wounded ego and petty jealousy?" Peterson was shaking, hyperventilating, a cornered animal. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically between Ilara and Tariq. "This is absurd," Tariq boomed, stepping forward. "She is a desperate woman flinging baseless accusations." It was then that Kalen finally moved. He picked up his phone from the table, his motion slow, deliberate. "Is it baseless, Tariq?" he asked, his voice lethally calm. "Because it's a strange coincidence. While we've been waiting, my IT security team, the best in the world as you know, ran a deep forensic analysis on the hotel's network servers. They traced the origin of the anonymous email to Croft's server, of course, but they also traced the file's initial transfer. It was sent 2 nights ago from a hotel guest Wi-Fi account to a burner phone. A phone that was, for a brief 2 minutes, pinging from the exact coordinates of a hallway alcove just outside the suite. It was a brilliant, masterful bluff built on the tiny seed of truth she had given him. And it hit its mark. Peterson shattered. A sob escaped his lips. "He made me do it," he cried, pointing a trembling finger at the stunned Tariq. "He said no one would get hurt. He said you had more money than God. He said he'd expose my family's debt and get my sister cut from the program if I didn't." The confession detonated in the room, vaporizing Croft's victory. Kalen's security materialized as if from the walls themselves, flanking a speechless Tariq and a sobbing Peterson, and escorting them from the room. In the ringing silence, Silas Croft stared at the empty space where his triumph had been. Kalen walked to Ilara. The ice in his eyes melted away, replaced by a look of profound, humbling awe and deep regret. "The biggest fool in this room was me," he said, his voice low, for her ears only. "I let my pride blind me. I allowed them to use it as a weapon against you. That is a mistake I will not make again. Your loyalty," he struggled for the words, "it is the most valuable asset I possess. Forgive me." Looking into his eyes, she saw not a billionaire, but a man stripped down to his core, humbled by the truth. "We were both betrayed," she said softly. "The important thing is that the legacy is now safe." He gave her a nod of profound gratitude, a silent confirmation of a new, unbreakable alliance. Then he turned to the shell-shocked Silas Croft, his voice now ringing with the calm, absolute power of a king restored to his throne. "Now, Silas," he said, a dangerous smile playing on his lips, "it seems the price of loyalty is actually quite high, and you are about to find out just how high. Let us discuss the real terms. My advisor, Ms. Vance, will be leading the negotiation." 3 months later, the air no longer smelled of seared scallops and fear, but of old paper, leather, and beeswax polish. Ilara stood not in a restaurant or a boardroom, but in a climate-controlled archive in Geneva, a room filled with history returned from the shadows. She wore a simple linen dress and comfortable shoes, her hands carefully examining a Sumerian clay tablet, a genuine one this time. After Croft's spectacular collapse in the penthouse, the deal had been entirely remade. The resort project was downsized, and the bulk of the investment was redirected into what was now the Al Jamil Vance Foundation for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage. Kalin had not just given her a job, he had given her a kingdom. Her mission? To use the foundation's immense resources to fund excavations, build museums, and most importantly, track down and repatriate stolen antiquities from the black market. The very market that men like Silas Croft had secretly profited from for years. The door to the archive opened, and Kalin walked in, carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee. He had flown in from New York just for this. The Sumerian tablet was their first major acquisition, recovered from a private collector in Zurich. He handed her a cup, his gaze falling on the ancient artifact. "To think," he said softly, "that this entire journey began with a fake." "It began with a man who was willing to listen to a ghost," she replied, smiling. She had long since repaid her family's debts, and her father's collection now formed the core of the Foundation's research library. Her mother was living comfortably, volunteering at the local museum. "You were never a ghost, Ilara," Kalin said, his eyes meeting hers over the rim of his cup. There was a warmth there now, a deep and abiding respect that had become the bedrock of their unique partnership. "You were a sleeping dragon. I'm just grateful you chose not to burn me to the ground." She laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. She had been invisible in a world of wealth, a silent observer in a life that wasn't hers. But here, surrounded by the whispers of history, she was finally, fully herself. She had discovered that true power wasn't in a title or a bank account. It was in knowing your own worth, in the quiet, accumulated knowledge of a lifetime, and in the courage to speak the truth, even when your voice shakes. The furious billionaire had been stopped in his tracks by her words, but in the silence that followed, they had learned to build a future together, one priceless piece of the past at a time.